Imagine you're going through months of just agonizing daily hormone injections. You're spending tens of thousands of dollars completely rearranging your life for this.
Yeah, it's a massive tool.
It really is. And finally, you get there. You have this perfectly healthy, genetically sound IVF embryo just ready to go. But then you go in for a routine ultrasound, and the doctor tells you the transfer is canceled.
Which is just heartbreaking.
Right. And why does it happen? Because the lining of your uterus, like the actual biological soil where this embryo needs to implant, is just maybe 2 millimeters too thin to sustain life.
It's a profoundly devastating scenario, honestly. And it's one that plays out in fertility clinics every single day.
Yeah.
I mean, you can have the absolute highest quality embryo in the world, but if the environment it's entering isn't structurally sound, the whole process just comes to a dead halt.
It's super frustrating. You feel like with all of our modern medicine, we should be able to just, fix a couple of millimeters of tissue.
Right, you'd think so.
But for you, the listener, today we are taking a deep dive into a potential solution that honestly sounds like pure science fiction.
It really does.
We are asking a really highly specific question today. Can a cutting-edge treatment known as exosome therapy actually repair and thicken the uterine lining for fertility?
Which is a question that puts us right on the bleeding edge of regenerative medicine.
Definitely. And to get to the bottom of this, we're synthesizing a really fascinating stack of material today. We've got a deep clinical research paper from the Peking Union Medical College Hospital. We've got standard guidelines from fertility clinics, some recent IVF news, and a pretty gripping investigative report from The Guardian.
Yeah, that Guardian piece about banned biological products is it's quite the read.
It is wild. So our mission for you today is to unpack what exosomes actually are, right? How they're showing this incredible promise in repairing damaged tissue in the lab, and then why using them in the real world is currently, a complete regulatory minefield.
Exactly. But before we can really grasp the futuristic fix, we kind of need to understand the underlying biological problem first.
Right. Let's talk about the endometrium.
So the endometrium is the inner layer of the uterus. And it's just an incredibly dynamic tissue.
Right.
If you look at standard clinical guidelines, you see that this lining undergoes massive cyclical changes every single month. It thickens up. It grows this really dense network of blood vessels, and the cellular structure changes entirely in direct response to hormones.
Hormones like estrogen and progesterone, right?
Exactly. It's constantly building itself up in anticipation of a pregnancy.
I think the best way to visualize this for the listener is to think of it like really high-stakes gardening.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, so the IVF embryo is this highly prized, incredibly delicate seed. And the endometrium is the topsoil.
Right.
So if your topsoil is super shallow, or if it's depleted of nutrients, or, it just lacks a good water supply, it honestly does not matter how perfect that seed is.
No, it doesn't.
It simply cannot take root.
That analogy holds up beautifully on a biological level, actually. Because for a successful embryo transfer in IVF, doctors are hunting for a very specific Goldilocks zone in that topsoil.
What are the exact measurements they're looking for?
So the ideal thickness is generally between 8 and 14 millimeters.
Just 8 millimeters.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
It's wild that so much emotional and financial weight rests on something that's literally thinner than a smartphone.
It is a tiny, tiny margin of error. Now, I should say 7 millimeters is considered the absolute bare minimum for an adequate thickness. But depth isn't the only metric that matters here.
Oh, really? Quality matters too, I'm assuming.
Oh, absolutely. Doctors use these high-resolution ultrasounds to look for a very specific trilaminar appearance.
Trilaminar, meaning like 3 distinct layers.
Yes, 3 distinct layers that are actually visible on the scan. And that trilaminar structure proves that the tissue isn't just, a thick, dumb block of cells. It's a highly organized, receptive environment.
Right. Means the soil is actually good quality.
Exactly. It indicates rich vascularity, meaning excellent blood flow, which you obviously need to provide oxygen and essential nutrients to the embryo the literal second it implants.
So what actually happens when the soil is just too thin or it lacks that healthy layered structure?
Yeah.
Standard procedure is to just throw hormones at it, right?
Traditionally, yes. A clinic will prescribe supplemental estrogen to try and stimulate the lining to grow, and then progestin to mature the tissue and get it ready for implantation.
Okay.
And they might also use medications that act as vasodilators to try and just, force more blood flow to the uterus.
But clearly that doesn't always work for everyone.
It doesn't. In some patients, the tissue simply stops responding to the hormonal signals entirely.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you can flood the system with estrogen, but if the cells in the endometrium are damaged, maybe from past infections or surgeries or just chronic inflammation, they essentially go deaf to the hormones instructions.
You just completely ignore the signal.
Exactly.
So soil stays shallow, the cycle gets canceled, and the patient is just left completely stranded. Right.
So if pumping the body full of traditional hormones fails, we obviously need a completely different biological mechanism to fix this tissue. What is the alternative?
Well, that is exactly where the scientific community started looking beyond traditional hormones.
Hmm?
They turned toward the actual mechanisms of cellular regeneration,
Hmm.
specifically exosomes.
Exosomes. Now, I have to admit, when I first started looking into this deep dive, I kind of assumed an exosome was like a type of stem cell.
A lot of people think that.
But it's actually not a cell at all, is it?
Not at all. Exosomes are infinitely smaller than cells. They're these tiny nanoscale membrane packages, basically microscopic bubbles that are secreted or released by cells.
Okay.
So if you picture a cell as a massive factory, the exosomes are the little cargo packages being shipped out of the loading dock.
Oh, that makes sense. So what's actually inside the cargo packages?
A highly curated mix of proteins, lipids, and genetic material, things like DNA fragments or messenger RNA.
So they're basically tiny biological text messages.
Like, the exosome itself isn't a living thing doing the heavy lifting of building the tissue. It's literally just a delivery vehicle.
That's a perfect way to think about it. They are the body's intercellular communication system.
But how do they actually deliver the message? Like, if I send a text message, it pings a cell tower and hits a phone. How does a microscopic bubble actually get its instructions inside another cell?
It all comes down to what the bubble is made of. The outer shell of an exosome is a lipid bilayer.
Okay.
And that is the exact same fatty membrane material that makes up the outer wall of human cells. So when an exosome floats through the body and bumps into a target cell, it doesn't have to, force its way in.
Right.
Because they're made of the identical material, the exosome's membrane simply fuses with the cell's membrane, almost like two soap bubbles just joining together.
Oh, that is so fascinating. It just melts right into the receiving cell and dumps its cargo of instructions inside.
Precisely. And those specific instructions tell the receiving cell how to behave, whether to grow, to heal, to fight an infection, or even to change its function entirely.
And if we bring this back to the fertility problem we're talking about, nature is already using this text message system in ways that are, frankly, mind-blowing.
Oh, absolutely.
Because developing embryos actually secrete their own exosomes.
They do. And, for a long time, we thought of the embryo as this passive seed that was just waiting to be dropped into the soil.
Right, just sitting there.
But recent clinical observations show it's actually a highly active participant. As an embryo develops, certain cells within it secrete a really vital protein called syncytin-1.
Which acts like a glue, right, to help the embryo stick to the uterine wall.
Exactly, it's the glue.
Yeah.
But researchers noticed from the IVF news data that the exact same cells producing that glue are also frantically pumping out exosomes into the surrounding maternal tissue.
Wow. So the embryo is sending biological text messages out into the mother's uterus saying, hey, I'm here. Start remodeling the tissue. Increase the blood flow. Get the environment ready for me.
It's a real-time, two-way dialogue. The embryo's exosomes are actively commanding the mother cells to prepare for pregnancy.
That is incredible.
Yeah, and if this communication pathway is disrupted early on, the embryo just won't implant. Or it can lead to severe placental complications down the line.
Okay, so if we know that embryos naturally use these exosomes to command the uterine lining to grow and adapt, scientists ask the most logical and honestly maybe the most ambitious next question.
Right.
Can we synthesize this process? Like, could we harvest exosomes in a lab, put them in a syringe, and use them to artificially repair a damaged endometrium before an embryo is even transferred?
And testing that exact hypothesis is what a rigorous research team at the Peking Union Medical College Hospital set out to do. They conducted this really deep, complex study to see if exogenous exosomes, meaning exosomes from outside the patient's body, could rescue that damaged uterine tissue.
Let's break down how they actually proved this, because the cellular mechanics here are just incredible. They didn't just use any random exosomes, right? They went straight to the heavy hitters.
They did. They utilized exosomes derived from human umbilical cord mesenchymal stem cells.
Umbilical cord stem cells, because those are basically the ultimate biological blank slates. They're packed with the instructions for rapid growth and regeneration.
Correct. So they cultivated these incredibly powerful stem cells in the lab and then harvested the exosomes they naturally secreted.
Okay, but how do they test it?
Well, to test if these text messages could actually fix a broken uterine lining, they had to recreate a broken lining in a petri dish. They developed what's known as a hypoxia injury model.
Hypoxia meaning a lack of oxygen. So they basically suffocated human endometrial cells.
Exactly. They severely restricted their oxygen supply. And this is crucial because it perfectly mimics the environment of a chronically thin, unresponsive endometrium in a human patient.
Oh, I see.
When a patient has poor vascularity, bad blood flow to the uterus, the tissue is essentially suffocating.
Right. And what actually happens to a cell when it suffocates?
Two major things happen. First, they undergo apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. The cells literally start dismantling themselves.
Yikes.
Yeah. And second, they undergo something called EMT, or epithelial mesenchymal transition.
Okay, EMT. What does that actually look like for the tissue itself?
So think of healthy endometrial epithelial cells like perfectly stacked, rigid bricks forming a really strong wall. That strong structure is what an embryo needs.
Right.
But under severe stress or lack of oxygen, those brick-like cells lose their shape entirely. They undergo EMT, which means they turn into mesenchymal cells, and those are loose, disorganized, and migratory.
So the wall basically turns to mush.
Yes, the structural integrity just
The
collapses.
soil loses its structure.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have this petri dish full of these suffocating, dying, mushy cells. And then the researchers introduced the umbilical cord stem cell exosomes.
Right.
They dropped the biological text messages into the dish. What did they actually observe?
They observed a near total reversal of the damage. Yes. The exosomes actively halted the apoptosis. The cells just stopped dying. Furthermore, they completely inhibited the EMT process, allowing the cells to maintain their healthy, brick-like structure despite the lack of oxygen.
But how? How does a tiny lipid bubble containing some, genetic fragments convince a dying, suffocating cell to suddenly rebuild itself?
This is honestly the most impressive part of that Peking Union study. They mapped the exact molecular pathway.
Wow.
They discovered that when the damaged cells absorbed these specific exosomes, it caused a massive spike in a specific microRNA called miR663A.
Okay, so miR663A is the specific text message that got delivered. What does the message actually say?
That microRNA's specific job is to suppress the expression of a gene inside the damaged cell called CDKN2A.
CDKN2A. What does that gene normally do?
In a normal functioning cell, CDKN2A acts as a strict biological stop sign. It is a brake pedal that prevents cells from dividing and growing endlessly.
Wait, hang on a second.
Yeah.
By delivering the miR663A text message, the exosome is telling the cell to basically permanently take its foot off the brake pedal.
To suppress it, yes. By turning off that stop sign, the exosome commands the dying endometrial cells to rapidly multiply, migrate, and rebuild the damaged tissue, completely overriding the suffocating environment.
Okay, but isn't taking the foot off a cell's brake pedal and causing, unregulated rapid cell growth, isn't that the literal definition of cancer?
And there it is. You've just hit the exact reason why this incredible scientific breakthrough is currently causing massive panic among medical regulators globally.
The reality check. Because while the lab data on repairing the endometrium is phenomenal, the jump to actually injecting this into a human being is a terrifying leap.
It is an absolute regulatory minefield right now. To understand the gravity of the risks, we really have to look at the current landscape of regenerative clinics, which was recently laid bare by that intense Guardian investigative report.
Right, because we know that some non-hormonal regenerative therapies are perfectly legal and widely used right now.
Yeah.
For example, some clinics offer treatments for things like vaginal dryness or rejuvenation using PRP, platelet-rich plasma.
Right.
But that involves drawing a patient's own blood, spinning it down, and injecting it back into their own body.
Exactly. Autologous treatments using your own biological material carry entirely different risk profiles. But utilizing human-derived exosomes from a donor, like those umbilical cord stem cells used in the Peking study, is a completely different story.
Yeah, that Guardian investigation highlighted that human cell-derived exosomes are actually strictly banned in cosmetics and clinics across the UK and the EU.
They are completely forbidden.
But despite the ban, investigators found these high-end clinics secretly offering exosome infusions anyway, marketing them as miracle cures for aging, hair loss, and tissue regeneration, and charging hundreds or thousands of pounds for them.
The black market demand is just staggering. Some clinics claimed ignorance of the regulations. Others tried to exploit legal loopholes by using exosomes derived from plants. Yeah. Or, in one particularly bizarre case noted in the investigation, exosomes extracted from salmon testicles.
Salmon testicles. Oh my God. The lengths people will go to.
I know.
But setting the salmon aside for a second, why exactly are human-derived exosomes so strictly banned? If they're just tiny bubbles of lipids and RNA, why do regulatory bodies view them as such a massive threat?
It comes down to a terrifying physical limitation in how we process them. Dr. Guillaume Van Niel, a pioneer in the field, laid out the fundamental problem here. Exosomes are the exact same size and share the exact same physical properties as viruses.
Wait, they are biologically indistinguishable in terms of size?
Yes, they are both nanoscale lipid-bound particles carrying genetic information, and this creates a massive bottleneck for safety. Currently, there is no reliable, scalable way to isolate human exosomes from viruses in a laboratory.
Why can't they just put the donor fluid in a centrifuge and, spin them apart? We separate blood cells that way all the time.
Because centrifuges rely on differences in mass and density to separate particles. Since an exosome and a virus have almost identical mass and density, they settle in the exact same layer during centrifugation.
Oh, what about washing them chemically or something?
You can't. The exosome is essentially a very delicate soap bubble. Any chemical wash harsh enough to destroy a virus will instantly destroy the exosome's lipid bilayer too, which completely ruins the therapy.
So if you extract millions of exosomes from human umbilical cord blood,
Right.
and there just happens to be a latent virus in that donor sample, you're extracting the virus right along with it.
Exactly. When a clinic injects those donor exosomes into a patient, they literally cannot guarantee they aren't directly injecting a viral pathogen straight into the tissue. The risk of disease transmission is just unacceptably high.
Wow. I mean, that alone justifies the ban. But the danger doesn't stop at viruses, does it? It goes back to the brake pedal issue we were talking about.
Right. Remember the cellular mechanism we discussed, suppressing the CDK-N2A stop sign? Cell biologists point out that an exosome package contains massive, highly concentrated payloads of growth factors. We are talking about signals designed to force rapid cellular proliferation.
And exosomes fuse with whatever cell membrane they bump into.
Exactly. They aren't smart bombs. They don't only target healthy tissue. Dr. James Edgar, a cell biologist interviewed about the clinic ban, offered a quote that perfectly summarizes the danger.
What did he say?
He said, "If you've got a melanoma, that could be pouring petrol on the fire."
Pouring petrol on a fire, that is chilling.
It really is.
I mean, think about it. If a patient is undergoing IVF and they happen to have a microscopic, totally undiagnosed cluster of precancerous cells in their uterine lining or their cervix,
Right.
and then a doctor floods that area with umbilical cord exosomes designed to force cells to multiply.
You are directly instructing the precancerous cells to rapidly divide and grow. The exact same biological mechanism that brilliantly repairs the damaged topsoil can simultaneously accelerate a tumor. Yeah. Until medical science develops the nanotechnology to perfectly purify exosomes and program them to exclusively target specific cells, the clinical application is just way too dangerous.
So bringing all of this complex science back down to earth for you, the listener, if you're currently navigating the endless waiting rooms and canceled cycles of IVF, what is the ultimate takeaway here?
The takeaway is that the landscape of regenerative medicine is genuinely shifting beneath our feet. Exosome therapy represents a legitimate, scientifically proven frontier for treating thin endometrial linings. It is not snake oil.
Right, the Peking Union study proves the mechanism is very real. Harnessing the body's intercellular text messages to rescue dying tissue absolutely works.
It works beautifully in a controlled laboratory environment, but the clinical reality is that it is not yet safe for human application.
Yeah.
The sheer impossibility of filtering out viruses, combined with the severe risk of triggering unregulated cancer growth, means that utilizing donor exosomes remains a lab-based miracle right now, not a clinic-based cure.
Which is obviously a really tough pill to swallow when you need a solution today. But synthesizing all these sources together points toward a really compelling idea.
Oh.
Something that wasn't explicitly spelled out in the research, but it feels like the inevitable next step to bypass these massive risks.
Where do you see it heading?
Well, the entire regulatory roadblock, the viral transmission and the unpredictable cancer risk, stems from using donor exosomes. using umbilical cord stem cells from someone else.
Right.
But if we go back to the natural biology we discussed earlier, an embryo already secretes its very own exosomes to prep the mother's body.
Yes, the exosomes released by the cells secreting syncytin 1.
Right. So if using foreign exosomes is too dangerous, could the future of IVF involve isolating the exosomes naturally produced by a patient's own lab-grown embryo?
Oh, wow.
Imagine if, while the embryo is developing in the incubator, clinicians harvest its specific exosomes. Then, a few days before the transfer, they use those perfectly matched, naturally designed text messages to prep the patient's uterine lining.
That is an incredibly provocative biological concept. You would be entirely eliminating the donor contamination risk.
Exactly.
And instead of hitting the tissue with massive generic growth factors from a stem cell, you're using the exact biological key that evolution designed for that specific lock.
It brings our gardening analogy full circle, really. Instead of buying experimental, highly volatile fertilizer from an outside vendor, you are letting the prized seed itself tell the soil exactly what it needs to thrive.
It's a beautiful way to put it.
The technology to actually do that might still be years away, but it highlights just how much potential is still waiting to be unlocked.
It's a vital reminder. The diagnostic tools and treatments we have right now might feel frustratingly limited, but the science of cellular communication is rapidly decoding the entire system. The solutions are getting sharper and more precise every single day.
They really are. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the microscopic world of fertility. Keep questioning the science and keep digging into the details.